At 3:42 a.m. Eastern Standard Time this morning, the United States Navy and the Indian Navy initiated a coordinated operation in the Strait of Hormuz that Iranian military commanders had no advance warning about, no defensive capability to counter, and no diplomatic mechanism to stop. What happened next represents the most significant shift in Middle Eastern naval power dynamics since Operation Praying Mantis in 1988. And what you are about to hear changes everything you thought you understood about Iran's ability to control the world's most critical energy choke point. The Strait of Hormuz is 21 miles wide at its narrowest point. Through this waterway flows approximately 21 million barrels of oil per day, representing roughly 21% of global petroleum consumption and 30% of all seaborne traded crude oil. The economic value of cargo transiting this strait exceeds $1 shakin gyu warm, $2 trillion annually. A single day of complete closure would remove $3. $3 billion in petroleum from global markets, trigger immediate price spikes affecting 8 billion people worldwide, and create supply chain disruptions requiring months to resolve. For 4 decades, the Islamic Republic of Iran has positioned control of this strait as its ultimate strategic leverage against the United States, Western Europe, and the broader international community. That leverage evaporated completely in the early hours of this morning. The operation that unfolded involved assets the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps had no capability to detect, employed tactics Iranian naval commanders had no training to counter, and achieved objectives that fundamentally eliminate Tehran's ability to threaten closure of the strait without facing immediate military consequences that would destroy what remains of Iran's naval capabilities within 72 hours. This is not speculation. This is not analysis based on incomplete information. This is documentation of an operation that occurred, produced measurable results, and changed the strategic calculation for every decision maker in Tehran. The United States has maintained continuous carrier strike group presence in the Persian Gulf and surrounding waters for decades. The USS Dwight D. Eisenhower Carrier Strike Group currently operates in the region with approximately 7,600 personnel, 65 aircraft, and supporting vessels including Arleigh Burke-class guided missile destroyers and Ticonderoga-class guided missile cruisers. These are known quantities. Iranian military planners track these vessels, monitor their movements, and develop contingency plans based on their locations and capabilities. What Iranian surveillance systems did not detect was the integration of Indian Navy assets into American operational planning at levels that create combined capabilities exceeding anything either Navy could achieve independently. India operates a blue water navy with one operational aircraft carrier, the INS Vikramaditya, displacing 45,400 tons and capable of deploying 30 aircraft, including MiG-29K fighters and multiple helicopter variants. India maintains 16 conventional submarines, 11 destroyers, 13 frigates, and 23 corvettes. The Indian Navy's Eastern Fleet and Western Fleet together represent the 5th largest navy globally by tonnage, with 67,228 active personnel and 55,000 Naval Reserve Force members. More importantly, India possesses specific capabilities the United States Navy either lacks or deploys in insufficient numbers to cover global commitments, particularly in anti-submarine warfare, mine countermeasures, and sustained surface patrol in littoral environments. The operation that commenced at 3:42 a.m. Eastern Time involved the simultaneous deployment of American P-8 Poseidon maritime patrol aircraft operating from undisclosed bases in the region, Indian Navy Poseidon variants conducting coordinated surveillance, American guided missile destroyers establishing outer security perimeters, Indian frigates conducting inter-strait patrol operations, and combined anti-submarine warfare assets, creating a detection grid that Iranian Kilo-class submarines cannot penetrate without immediate identification and targeting. This is not a temporary surge operation. This is the establishment of permanent combined operational architecture. The Indian government announced its participation through carefully calibrated diplomatic language that emphasized freedom of navigation, international law, and the necessity of keeping global energy arteries open. What the announcement did not specify was the operational integration depth. Indian naval officers are currently embedded in American command centers. American tactical coordinators are aboard Indian vessels. Real-time intelligence sharing occurs at classification levels typically reserved for Five Eyes Alliance members. targeting data flows bidirectionally. This represents a fundamental shift in how the United States structures its Middle Eastern naval presence, and Iranian military planners recognize they lack any mechanism to sever this cooperation. Subscribe to Dr. Elena Harris right now and hit that notification bell, because what I am about to reveal about the specific capabilities this combined force brings to the Strait of Hormuz will fundamentally change how you understand the balance of power in this region. And this information is moving faster than mainstream coverage can track. Iran's primary naval threat capability in the Strait of Hormuz consists of approximately 200 fast attack craft, 20 Chinese-built Hudong-class missile boats, 3 Russian-built Kilo-class submarines, and extensive land-based anti-ship cruise missile batteries positioned along the Iranian coastline. The Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps Navy operates the majority of these assets through a distributed command structure designed to complicate targeting and enable swarming tactics against superior conventional naval forces. Iranian military doctrine assumes that massed small boat attacks, combined with submarine operations and land-based missile strikes, could inflict sufficient damage on American naval vessels to make sustained operations politically unsustainable for Washington. That assumption depended on the United States operating alone, stretched thin by global commitments, and lacking the sustained surveillance and patrol density necessary to counter distributed Iranian assets simultaneously across the entire strait. The integration of Indian naval capabilities eliminates those assumptions completely. Indian anti-submarine warfare helicopters operating from frigates provide continuous coverage that American surface vessels cannot maintain alone. Indian patrol craft operating in rotation create persistent presence that American ships cycling through maintenance periods cannot sustain. Indian mine countermeasure vessels provide capabilities that American MCM assets, concentrated primarily in the Western Pacific, cannot duplicate in sufficient numbers. The combined force does not double American capabilities. It multiplies them by creating overlapping systems that eliminate gaps Iranian planners had identified and intended to exploit. The economic implications for Iran are immediate and catastrophic. Tehran currently exports approximately 1,400,000 barrels of oil per day, despite American sanctions, generating roughly $210 million in daily revenue, or $7 billion annually. These exports depend absolutely on the ability to transit the Strait of Hormuz. Iranian threats to close the strait have historically served as deterrent against military action, diplomatic pressure, and economic warfare. The credibility of those threats depended on the belief that Iran could inflict sufficient costs on any nation attempting to keep the strait open by force. The combined U.S.-India naval operation demonstrates that Iran cannot impose meaningful costs without suffering the complete destruction of its naval forces, the elimination of its coastal missile batteries, and the permanent loss of its ability to export energy. Iranian military commanders are currently conducting emergency strategic reassessments. Sources within the Iranian defense establishment, speaking through channels to regional media outlets, including Iran International, indicate that Revolutionary Guard Navy leadership held crisis meetings throughout the morning, following detection of the combined operations. The meetings reportedly focused on whether Iran possesses any tactical or strategic response that would not result in the immediate loss of the Islamic Republic's entire naval capability. The consensus assessment concluded that no such response exists. Iran can accept the new reality, or Iran can initiate conflict it will lose within 96 hours. Those are the only options Tehran possesses. The Indian decision to commit naval forces to Hormuz operations reflects calculations extending far beyond the immediate crisis. India imports approximately 4.5 million barrels of oil per day, with roughly 62% originating from Middle Eastern sources transiting the Strait of Hormuz. Indian economic growth projections depend on reliable energy supplies at stable prices. Disruption of Hormuz traffic would inflict immediate damage on the Indian economy, measured in tens of billions of dollars within the first month of any closure. India's decision to deploy naval assets represents direct national interest protection rather than alliance obligation to Washington. This distinction matters enormously for the durability of the arrangement. American alliance commitments fluctuate based on domestic political changes, budgetary pressures, and competing global priorities. Indian commitment to keeping Hormuz open stems from economic necessity that transcends any particular government or political party. New Delhi will maintain this naval presence regardless of who occupies the White House, what policies Congress enacts, or how American Middle East strategy evolves, because Indian economic security depends absolutely on Hormuz remaining open. China is watching this development with profound concern. Beijing imports approximately 1 million barrels of oil per day, with roughly 48% transiting the Strait of Hormuz. Chinese economic planners have spent 2 decades developing alternative routes, including pipelines through Central Asia, increased Russian imports, and domestic production expansion. Despite these efforts, Chinese dependence on Middle Eastern oil transiting Hormuz remains at levels where any extended closure would trigger immediate industrial disruption, transportation fuel shortages, and economic contraction. The establishment of permanent Indian naval presence in the strait, operating in coordination with American forces, creates a scenario where India and the United States together control the energy artery Chinese economic growth requires. Chinese diplomatic responses over the past 12 hours have emphasized respect for international law, freedom of navigation, and peaceful resolution of disputes. What these careful statements do not address is Beijing's complete inability to prevent the U.S. in India combined operation from continuing indefinitely. China operates one overseas military base in Djibouti, maintains no naval facilities in the Persian Gulf, and lacks any mechanism to project sustained naval power into the region sufficient to challenge American and Indian combined forces. Chinese naval expansion over the past 15 years created the world's largest navy by hull count, but that fleet remains concentrated in the Western Pacific and South China Sea, unable to influence events occurring 4,600 miles away in the Strait of Hormuz. The timing of this operation coincides with accelerating Iranian economic crisis. Iranian currency, the rial, currently trades at approximately 620,000 rials to $1, having lost 94% of its value since 2018. Iranian inflation runs at approximately 47% annually, according to official government statistics, with independent economists estimating actual inflation exceeds 65%. Iranian foreign currency reserves have declined from $122 billion in 2011 to approximately $19 billion currently. Iranian unemployment officially registers at 9.1%, with youth unemployment exceeding 24%, and actual unemployment, including discouraged workers, likely approaching 18%. These economic conditions create internal pressure the regime cannot relieve through oil revenue increases because oil exports depend on Hormuz access that U.S.-India forces now control completely. Iranian domestic politics are fracturing under this pressure. Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei is 85 years old, in declining health, and faces succession questions that have produced competing factions within the regime's power structure. President Masoud Pezeshkian represents reformist elements seeking diplomatic resolution and economic normalization. Revolutionary Guard commanders, including those controlling the IRGC Navy, represent hardline elements opposed to any accommodation with the United States. These factions had maintained uneasy coexistence based on shared assumption that Iran retained sufficient leverage through Hormuz threat to extract concessions from Washington. That leverage is gone. The factions now fight over how to respond to a situation where Iran possesses no good options. The United States and India conducted this operation without seeking approval from the United Nations Security Council, without notifying the International Maritime Organization in advance, and without coordinating with European allies who maintain separate naval presence in the region through Operation European Maritime Awareness in the Strait of Hormuz. This unilateral approach signals that Washington and New Delhi view Hormuz security as too critical to subject to multilateral decision-making processes where Russian and Chinese vetoes could prevent action. The operation establishes facts on the water that diplomatic protests cannot reverse. Here is where it gets truly extraordinary. The combined force did not merely establish presence. American and Indian naval vessels conducted live-fire exercises in the strait itself, demonstrating the ability to engage surface targets, aerial threats, and subsurface contacts in the most congested shipping lane on Earth without disrupting commercial traffic. Iranian military observers monitored these exercises from coastal positions, watching weapon systems eliminate practice targets with precision that would translate directly to destruction of Iranian vessels in any actual conflict. The exercises serve as demonstration, warning, and proof of capability simultaneously. Iran received a message that requires no diplomatic interpretation. Iranian state media has published almost nothing about these developments. Press TV, Fars News Agency, and Tasnim News Agency, all outlets controlled by or closely aligned with the regime, have provided minimal coverage focusing on routine naval activities and freedom of navigation principles. This silence is itself significant. Iranian media typically treats any foreign military activity near Iranian waters as aggression requiring extensive coverage, public statements from military commanders, and speeches from political leaders. The absence of such coverage indicates the regime recognizes it has no effective response and prefers to avoid drawing domestic attention to its strategic impotence. International oil markets responded to news of the combined operation with immediate price declines. Brent crude fell $4.20 per barrel in the 18 hours following the first reports, reflecting trader assessment that the primary risk to Gulf oil exports has been substantially reduced. This price movement validates market perception that U.S.-India combined presence represents stabilizing rather than escalatory development. The reduction in risk premium removes approximately $168 billion annually from global energy costs, distributed across every economy dependent on petroleum imports. Iranian revenue losses from this price declined total approximately $5 for the SARS, 88 million per day based on current export volumes. Compounded over a full year, this represents $15 billion in lost revenue from price effects alone, independent of any volume reductions that might result from increased sanctions enforcement or continued export difficulties. The Iranian government budget, already operating at a deficit approaching 5% of GDP, cannot absorb revenue losses of this magnitude without eliminating subsidy programs that maintain fragile social stability. The strategic question facing Tehran is whether to accept this new reality quietly or attempt some form of response that reasserts Iranian relevance. Acceptance means acknowledging that Iran cannot threaten Hormuz closure credibly, cannot challenge American military presence effectively, and cannot prevent India from operating freely in waters Iran considers within its sphere of influence. This represents humiliating strategic defeat for a regime that has built its identity around resistance to American power. The alternative response options, however, lead to outcomes far worse than humiliation. Iran could attempt to strike Indian naval vessels using Revolutionary Guard fast attack boats, shore-based missiles, or submarine-launched torpedoes. Such an attack would trigger immediate American military response, regardless of whether American vessels were directly targeted, because the United States and India are operating under coordinated rules of engagement that treat attacks on either nation's forces as attacks on both. The resulting conflict would last approximately 48 to 96 hours and conclude with the complete destruction of Iran's naval capabilities, the elimination of coastal missile sites, and quite possibly American strikes on Iranian nuclear facilities that have been under development for decades. The regime would face military defeat, economic collapse, and potential internal uprising from a population that would blame leadership for provoking catastrophic conflict. Iran could attempt to close Hormuz through mining operations, deploying the estimated 2,000 to 5,000 naval mines Iranian forces maintain in inventory. American and Indian mine countermeasure capabilities would begin clearing operations immediately. Commercial traffic would be disrupted for approximately 2 to 4 weeks while clearing operations proceeded, and Iran would face international isolation, exceeding anything experienced during the current sanctions regime. The economic damage to Iran would be permanent, as global energy markets would accelerate diversification away from dependence on any supplies requiring Hormuz transit that Iran could threaten. Iran could attempt diplomatic outreach to Russia and China, seeking intervention that would pressure the United States and India to reduce their combined presence. Russia, however, benefits from higher oil prices that result from Middle Eastern instability and has no interest in helping Iran stabilize export revenues that compete with Russian petroleum sales. China needs Hormuz to remain open and would prefer that India and the United States guarantee that openness rather than requiring Chinese naval deployment thousands of miles from home waters. Neither Moscow nor Beijing will rescue Tehran from strategic consequences of its own decades of threatening behavior. What happens next will determine whether Iran's Islamic Republic survives the next 24 months as a coherent governing entity or fragments into competing power centers, unable to maintain central authority. The economic pressure is unsustainable. The military position is untenable. The diplomatic isolation is increasing. The internal fractures are widening. The regime has run out of leverage, run out of options, and run out of time. The U.S. USAF in India combined operation in the Strait of Hormuz did not create these problems. It eliminated Iran's last mechanism for escaping them. Subscribe and turn on notifications because events are developing faster than any 24-hour news cycle can track. And what happens in the next 72 hours will determine outcomes affecting global energy security, Middle Eastern stability, and great power competition for the next decade. Make sure you are subscribed to Dr. Elena Harris so you do not miss the moment when Iran makes its choice between acceptance and annihilation. The next 48 hours are critical. Iranian leadership is conducting emergency consultations right now. Military commanders are presenting options. Political factions are positioning for whatever comes next. The decision being made in Tehran at this moment will either acknowledge the new strategic reality or trigger the final confrontation that brings down the Islamic Republic. There is no middle path. There is no diplomatic escape. There is only the choice between survival and destruction, and that choice must be made before the weekends.